All right, to start off this video about the Canon C70, I feel like there are two factors that truly make this camera a powerhouse camera. But the reality is that one of those factors didn't come until about 8 to 12 months after the release of the camera. And that factor was the reason why I went ahead and purchased it, because prior to having that added, I wasn't sold on this camera, especially at the price point of close to $6,000 retail. So what is that? I mean, what are those two factors? Well, the first one is the dual gain output sensor that is inside of this camera. That sensor is the same sensor that Canon had or included on the Canon C300 Mark II, which is almost a $10,000 camera. A sensor that a lot of people came to love. And it was a beautiful sensor because having two gain outputs, basically the sensor reading for the highlights and reading for the noise and the shadows, putting that together and giving you a really high dynamic image, people were blown away by the fact that they put that in the C70. But again, I wasn't completely sold even with that, even though it was such a great, it is such a great and beautiful sensor. I wasn't totally sold at that price point until I think 8, 9, 10 months later, they included within a firmware update. This is Canon we're talking about. They included through a firmware update, Canon RAW internally. You could record 12-bit Canon RAW in 60 frames, 30 frames, and 24 frames inside of this camera. And that just blew my mind because that is not typical of Canon. Even though I do love Canon cameras have been very good to me in my business and my workflow, I was not expecting that from Canon. And that is what I feel like truly matched with the great sensor, having the ability to shoot RAW internally on SD cards. How is that possible? On SD cards, to be able to shoot 12-bit RAW, that is what ultimately sold me, and I moved away from my older Canon C200, which shot RAW as well, and I went on to get the C70. Now, if you're somewhat new to cameras and wondering about color bit depth and why that's so important, the difference between 8-bit, 10-bit, and 12-bit, and then obviously going on to cameras that are much nicer that have like 16-bit, that is a massive change in the amount of colors that you can capture within a camera. 10-bit color is amazing, and yes, this camera at its launch had 10-bit color, an XFAVC, an MP4, but again, I wasn't totally sold on just those codecs and those formats. But then having 12-bit, you go from 1 billion colors all the way, I think, to 68 billion colors in 12-bit. And so just having that versatility within RAW is amazing. No, I do not shoot RAW for all of my projects. I feel like I'd probably only shoot RAW for maybe a third of the projects that I shoot. But having RAW and being able to do that for that third of my projects is very important and is very crucial to my workflow. The reason why I love working with RAW is it's very similar to working with a RAW photo. So if you bring it into Premiere, you bring it into DaVinci, you can manipulate that RAW codec just like you would a photo. So you can change the white balance, you can change the exposure, you can change the tint. You have so much more control over that raw footage than you do with other codecs. And there are just projects where maybe we have to move really quick on location, the lighting's changing, or we don't know exactly what the lighting is gonna be between the different scenes. Or maybe it's just me, I'm all by myself and I'm a one-man band, and I know that maybe in post I need to vary things up a little bit, I need the flexibility to adjust. There's just a lot of reasons why you would want to shoot RAW. And again, with 12-bit, we get more colors. Ultimately, the quality of the image is just gonna be superb and very nice. But again, it's not applicable for all the projects that I do, and I certainly don't use it because it is very, very heavy and very intensive when it comes to storage. Now, when you compare the C70 to two other competitors that are very close in terms of what they offer internally and the features they offer within the camera, you have to consider the Sony FX6 and also the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro. The FX6 is gonna cost $6,000 retail, and the crazy thing about that, even though I think it is a phenomenal camera and I've seen people do amazing work with it, is it doesn't have RAW internally. You can do RAW externally to an external recorder, but then all of a sudden you've got to buy more gear, you've got to have a different workflow, and yes, you can do it and you can use it and it's there and it's beautiful, but there's just more steps involved, and that's why I love having it internally within the C70. There's just fewer steps and you don't have to have as much gear to accomplish that. But then on the flip side with Blackmagic, all the way down to a price point of $2,500, which just blows my mind that Blackmagic can do that. You have 6K RAW, not just 4K RAW, this is 4K RAW. You have 6K RAW internally within that camera and pretty much most of the same features as the C70. There's several that are lacking that in my opinion are big, especially if you're a one person or two person crew, and that is the efficiency of having really good autofocus. The C70 has exceptional autofocus, especially with more recent firmware updates where the eye detection is even better. You don't get that on the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro or any of most of the Blackmagic cameras. You only have one-shot autofocus. You don't have any kind of continuous autofocus. Of course, I do shoot manual a lot of times, but the thing is when you're shooting interviews, and like I said, if you're a one-man, one-woman, or two-person crew, it's important and it's kind of a safety net to have really good autofocus, and the Canon C70 has that. I mean, most recently when I shot something just last week, I was by myself and I really had to rely on the autofocus because there are some people that you're interviewing that tend to move forward or move around a lot, or they may adjust in their chair. And if you're stuck in manual and you're monitoring everything else from the composition to the audio to all, to another camera or two other cameras, that is a lot of things to manage. And if you don't have autofocus, things can go awry pretty quickly, especially when you're shooting interviews. Now, shooting B-roll is a totally different story. I shoot manual a lot of times when I'm shooting B-roll just to have full control over where I'm showing my focus and where I'm pulling my focus. So that in and of itself for the Blackmagic isn't as big of a deal, but also the C70 in terms of battery life, this is where the C70 really does shine more so than the Blackmagic. The Blackmagic is using smaller batteries. To get more power, you're gonna have to put a battery grip on that, which does make the Blackmagic camera a little bit more unstable. And also just managing battery life, I've seen on the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro, it's difficult to see how the batteries are decreasing in life versus the Canon cameras, or the C70 shows you the exact amount of minutes you have left on that battery. And that battery life indicator is very, very true. It's very accurate. I've never had trouble with it saying I'm getting low and then all of a sudden I'm out of power. Like right now I have a full BP-A30, which is the smaller one, and it's telling me I have 165 minutes of battery. Again, it's showing me exactly the amount of minutes that I have on this battery. And then if I put in the BP-A60, which is the bigger one, now I have nearly 300 minutes of battery life in just this one battery. Now, if you've never worked with cinema cameras or you're just new to it, the amazing thing about it is having built-in NDs. So if you're trying to keep your shutter and your aperture the same like indoors as you would outdoors, you're going to need those ND filters. And so the C70 has up to 10 stops of ND. And you might be wondering, are you ever going to use 10 stops? Yes, there are some times like when I was in Phoenix and times here where I live in Memphis, where if it's in the middle of the summer and I'm doing an outdoor shoot, and say it's maybe not the most ideal lighting conditions, like it's high noon, but that's the only time maybe I'm covering an event, or that's the only time I can work with this client, I have pumped up this thing. I have used all the way up to, I don't think I've used 10 stops, but I've definitely used 8 stops of ND. So other cameras that only have 6 stops of ND, you will find yourself in situations where if you are at high noon in the middle of the summer, you're going to wish that you had 2 more stops or maybe even 4 more stops of ND. And that is so helpful and so crucial for me that the C70 has that. Now, there is one other factor that really does make this a powerhouse, at least for me especially, and that is the form factor of this camera, the size of this camera. It's not so wide that it makes it really difficult to get it on a gimbal. So I have the DJI Ronin RS3 Pro, and what's amazing is I can put the C70 on this gimbal. It fits perfectly without having to add additional custom plates to move it over. That's what you would have to do like with the Blackmagic because it's too wide to sit within this cradle here. And so I can easily throw the C70 onto a gimbal like this. It's light enough that I can throw it on there without having to make a lot of manipulations or adjustments to it. And then all of a sudden I've got incredibly smooth, great gimbal capabilities with a cinema camera. Now in the past, you would have to move up to bigger gimbals like Movies or Ronan's, I think the Ronin M line of gimbals, all fantastic gimbals, but gimbals that are going to start costing you into $3, $4, $5, upwards of $10,000 to be able to put a larger cinema camera on a gimbal like that. You wouldn't be able to put it on something like this. Obviously, they didn't have the RS3 Pro back then either, but the form factor, the size of the C70 really makes it incredibly versatile to mount it and to put it on different devices, whether it's a gimbal or maybe it's a car mount. But just the size of the C70 makes it way more versatile, and having versatility with the size of that and where you can put it and where you can mount it and what devices you can use with it just, again, makes it very powerful. All right, so one of the things you might be saying is, hey, Trent, I could pick up the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro. I can pick up 2 of those for the price of what the C70 retails for. The C70 does retail for $5,500, although I have seen some used ones floating around for $4,500, $4,600, which is a much better price for C70s that are in excellent condition. But yes, you could buy 2 Blackmagic 6K Pros for the price of 1 C70. And I get that. If Blackmagic works for you, if those cameras are a good option for you, and having 2 of those is going to be a better setup for you than just buying 1 C70, I can understand that. But at the end of the day, it really depends on what you're going to be shooting, which projects you're going to be shooting, and what you really need the cameras for and the efficiencies for. For me, like I said, there are times where I am by myself and I do need to rely on having really good autofocus, especially for interviews. I shoot a lot of interviews, I do a lot of corporate work, I do some documentary work. So having autofocus, having really good reliable autofocus is an efficiency for me. It's a fail-safe for me and something that I really need to rely on. Now, if you don't need that and you're going to go manual and you can trust going manual, or maybe you have somebody who can watch your cameras while you're doing interviews and things like that, then sure, the Blackmagic cameras are probably incredible to go with, and yes, you can buy 2 of those for the price of 1. But at the end of the day, the 2 things, or really the 3 things I should say, that really make the Canon C70 a powerhouse of a camera is the DGO sensor, which is phenomenal. Second is the ability to record Canon RAW, 12-bit Canon RAW internally within the camera in not only 60 frames, but then also in 30 and 24. And then the third is just the size of the C70, that you can mount it, you can put it on a gimbal like the RS3 Pro, and you can mount it in a bunch of different places because the size and the weight of that camera is much less than like the C300 or even the C200 that I owned. So yes, in my opinion, the C70 is a powerhouse of a camera because of everything it can do within the camera and then also just the size of the camera. I have truly loved and enjoyed this camera over the last year, and I quite honestly don't see myself switching from the C70. If anything, I'm probably going to buy another C70 in the future, so I can have 2 of them running at the same time. Yeah, it's definitely been worth it. Is it an investment? Yes, it's an investment, but it's definitely worth it because the camera is so versatile.